Good evening to one and all. Creativity is nothing but a mindset free. Designing is a platform to express one's emotions. The content that we present illustrates our thoughts, and it's necessary to choose the right type that best fits our idea and the message to convey. So today, in Color Your Space, I have Ms. Remajothi S, IEEE Student Member from LBS Institute of Technology for Women, to talk about an introduction to typography. If you have any doubts during the session, please feel free to pitch it up in the live YouTube chat and we shall answer it at the end of the session. Over to you, Rama.
Hi everyone, I hope I'm audible right now. Alright, so good evening everyone. I hope you're all doing okay. I'm here to share my knowledge on what I know about typography and what you need to know if you have any intention in designing or something like that. Anyway, let's get started on what typography is. What are the principles following it? What are the common family fonts and the terminologies where I would explain a few of them and then try to understand why we need this as well. All right. So what is it exactly? So typography is basically an art form that has been around for hundreds of years. It's been used everywhere. Now, the words and texts are all around us every day in almost everything we do. So, if I take any, or if you take any sort of brochures, posters, or any sort of visual design, in every piece of type you see, somebody has considered how the letters, sentences, and paragraphs will look in order for it to be read by us or make us feel a certain way when we look at it. Sometimes it looks good because it's done well, others are not. I wouldn't want to differentiate between what are bad designs and what are good designs, as everything is tried based on what we learn. Anyway, the basic thing in typography is if we choose the wrong type of font, it will make the content look boring and unattractive. So I would be explaining the principles of typography, the basic 5 principles that are to be used in this. So the first one I've mentioned here is the font choice. So over here, I have mentioned some of the families or typefaces in precise. So these are some of the fonts, the common fonts that are to be considered. So in terms of body text, the serif fonts are more readable. One second. All right. I hope it's visible to everyone right now. Anyway, I would start with the font choice. All right. So again, I'll start over again. So in terms of body text, over here we have the serif fonts, and it is more readable when it comes to the print, and it becomes less readable on the web due to low screen resolutions and sort of like that. So there's a general rule of thumb for all of these concepts. So over here is to use serif fonts for print and sans serif on the web. Although it all depends on what kind of context you're going to be using for that. And serif and sans serif or even these script fonts can be extremely effective in headlines and logos. If you would see the logos or any sort of headlines, we're mostly using bold type of fonts, or it depends if you want to use script types of fonts. It depends on the context, as I mentioned before. Over here on the right side, I've mentioned the size. That's the second basic principle. And for this, you need to know what kind of audience you'll be targeting. So you need to know what's it for, what's the context, what is the like, who is the audience, and if there are children or if there are old people, you need the size of the font or you need the type of the font to be depending on them. Everything you do in typography or design or whatever it is, it depends on what kind of audience you'll be targeting. So over here, if you want your text to be scanned easily, it should be larger and it should be like a less effort for the eyes. And for example, if your design is aimed at children or the elderly, as I mentioned, a small font size it's not advisable at all. So you should actually prefer, or you should think twice who will be reading it and who is going to be your audience for that. And moving away from just the body text, we need to form a hierarchy of importance, with the most important elements occupying a larger font size. So here, if I'm going to use a very small size for the poster, which targets a larger audience, like it's children or something, they wouldn't rather read it. Or even if it's old people, they wouldn't read it. So you need to make sure what kind of font you're going to be using and the size. The next thing that would target or is the most important basic principle is the letter spacing and line height. So if I add a paragraph with no line spacing, all right, this content over here has a moderate or an optimum letter spacing, and it has a line height as well. So if I reduce the line height or if I reduce the letter spacing, it's gonna look very congested and it's gonna make it's gonna be hard to read. All right. I guess, right. Okay. So I was just mentioning what is letter spacing and line height is. So if you could see the content here, the one which I mentioned over here, this one has the optimum line height and the line spacing. If I use it's gonna be very hard for us to read or anything like that. So over here too, we have a general rule of thumb for letter spacing, that is the larger the text, the lower the letter spacing value. For example, if you have a negative letter spacing on your body text, it would appear all crunched up. That is, over here, we have a negative spacing here. So it's going to be looking all congested and crunched up and it'll be very difficult to read. Whereas if we increase the line spacing and line height as it's on the left side, it's going to be much easier to read. Line height is also really important in order to ensure readability over here. As you can see over here, I haven't mentioned what it's like. In a brief idea, I would be talking about what readability is. So that's why I haven't mentioned any sort of pictorial representation over there. And so I hope you understood what letter spacing and line height is. And the next one we could go with is alignment and proximity. So over here, if it's the same as letter spacing and line height. I mean, the concepts are the same, but the ideology behind this is the same. So over here, if we align the text improperly or anything like that, it's going to look really bad. So if I place these elements below and over there without any alignment, it's going to look really bad. So over here, we have to align the text properly so that we can organize the content in the reader's mind and reduce the effort required of them to make sense of what that content is. So over here, if we look at the text over here, it's aligned properly and it has a grid system as well, which is it's an external topic for this. So over here, grids are a great way to maintain an alignment. As I mentioned, there's a grid system for maintaining the content in a certain area. So over here, it's a great way to maintain alignment and in your design and to ensure that everything is positioned on that particular page. Anything out of alignment could be easily noticeable for a designer in specific. Otherwise, even a common person would know. So, lastly, the last principle is readability, where you need to make sure whether it's readable or not. So, you can ask for a few opinions as well, but always make sure that the end result of the content is always readable. So the next concept I'll be going into another concept that is important in typography. All right. So as I said before, typography is basically like the arranging of letters to make them look legible. And it should be aesthetic looking as well. So it would be pleasing to the eye. Now, if I talk about typefaces and fonts, there's difference between both of them. So if it's a common person or if you're alien to this concept, it's totally fine. But then to a designer, it should be known what is the difference between a typeface and a font. So a typeface, in simple words, I'd say typeface is or the family of fonts, and font is a specific form of that particular typeface, or it differs by style, or it can be italics of that family, or it could be a bold of that family, or it could vary among the sizes or something like that. So I would show you like what's the basic difference. You would understand what it means. Over here, I've mentioned a font, the difference between the font and a typeface. So a font is the variation of weights of a typeface. If you take like a particular family, Arial, Calibri, Vadana, or any sort of family of fonts, it's gonna have like variations of styles and weights and everything in it. So over here, if I take the typeface Arial, the fonts are gonna be Arial regular, italic, bold, semi-bold, and all that. So there's a difference between typeface and a font. So this is the basic difference which you need to know, like the very basic concept that you need to know in typography. All right. In typography, there's another concept which is typeface anatomy or font anatomy, where you actually have a certain anatomy required for this, and you need to know what that means. And there are various concepts, as you can see here in this picture. I've mentioned only a few of them, while the rest of them are, self-understandable. All right. So over here, I've mentioned what an ascender is, what descender, terminal, stem, link, year, and all that is. So you would know what an uppercase character and lowercase character is. A common person would know that. It's simple. Now, if I talk about ascender, and as I mentioned here, I'll be talking about that in specific, and I'll get started with that. So ascender is the part of the letter that extends above. As you can see here, the blue part that's been represented in all of these letters are the ones that I'm going to be talking about, the concepts. So the ascender over here is the blue part that extends upwards. All right. Now the descender, it's a stroke that drops below the baseline. There's a baseline for the particular typeface. So there's a line. There'll always be a line, like a centralized line, where the ascender and the descender and the lowercase terminal, all these terminologies or the terms, it actually represents whatever that's representing in this. So in ascender, as I mentioned, it's something that extends above. In descender, it extends below. And in terminal, it's the part where it's the end of the letter. These are the like serif fonts, so there's a difference. And for the stem, it's a main vertical kind of stroke, okay, for an upright letter form, and it's also called a stroke. And The second last one is a link where it connects the top and bottom bowls of a lowercase letter. Okay, it does not apply to the uppercase letter. All right. And the year is, it's a very short stroke at the top. Okay, these actually apply to the ones in the lowercase characters. So these include in the typeface anatomy, and there are more terminologies included in this, and you could probably look into that more later. But these are the main ones that I would rather look into now. So after that, after the typeface, we need to know what kind of families or what kind of typefaces are being used and how are they classified since the olden times. So over here, I've mentioned a few of them. There are more of the classification to this, and I've mentioned the main ones. So in serif, there's old style and transitional, the square, and the serif actually includes a lot of styles in it. So over here, the serif old style, I'd explain what it is in detail, like individually. So it's characterized by curved glyphs. As you can see, like a serif one, it has curved glyphs with the axis inclined to the left. All of these have a certain axis where all of these are being distinguished between each other. So there's a particular axis, and over here there's a minimal contrast between the thin and thick strokes, and there's bracketed serifs and all that. You don't have to know the much detailed version of it. You need to know what's the difference between all of these typefaces are. So in transitional, there's a difference between old style and transitional. Not much of a difference, but depending on the axis, there's a difference in it. So over here in old style, there's only minimal contrast between the thick and thin strokes, and in transitional, there is more contrast to it. All right, and all these concepts might look or seem really alien and really weird, but trust me, it's going to be really useful later if you're looking into it. All right, so in modern one, it's mostly like characterized by high or dramatic kind of contrast between the strokes over here. As you could see, there's like really thick kind of strokes between the letters in over there. So it's gonna have, again, it's depending upon the axis. In square serif, you could see it's not entirely different. It's much more transitioned from the old ones. All right, so they're often like geometric or square in style. And the geometric one, these are the ones which we usually use like for technical purposes or anything like that. Or even logos. I wouldn't narrow it down to technical purposes. I'm talking about free fonts over there. And for geometric, it's like these typefaces are mostly based on simple geometric shapes and usually include like really thin strokes or modern type strokes where it's often connecting the scripts. Rounded forms. Sorry. Alright, so the next one, there are certain forms of scripts, like various different forms of scripts. And the one I've mentioned here is formal scripts, which would actually look elegant and appealing to the ones compared to the rest of ones. The informal ones look mostly like handwritings or where we use it informally or any sort of logos. It depends on the context, as I had mentioned at the beginning. So formal scripts are mostly like flowing loops and flourishes with graceful rhythmic strokes. As you can see, it's really elegant and representing a kind of a peaceful feeling in it. And the black letter, as you can see, it's mostly used in old kind of typography. It was if I would mention the history about it, it was set in the Bible or anything like that. Or if we could talk about any books, it would be used there as well. And the black letter typefaces, that is this one, is characterized by like dense black texture and highly decorated caps. It's more difficult to read, but then it's more elegant and as in it has a really more complicated, sophisticated style, but even more traditional. It depends. Now, the next one is like the basic ones. Again, it's you need to know this concept in thing because you need to know compared to the previous ones, you need to know this one as it's the basic ones. Alright, so over here, if I compare the serif versus sans serif, the serif has these tail endings. Alright, and sans serif is more like modern and all that. So it differs in that way. And proportional versus monospaced classification is mostly like over here. The proportional one, it has a letter spacing which is optimum, while in monospace, the letters would be more narrow and the spacing between them would be equal but much smaller than compared to the proportional typefaces. So this is the basic difference between like the common basic classification of a font or two types of fonts to be precise. So those are like the basic concepts or the terminologies that you really need to know if you are starting off with a font or a typography, or if you want to create a font also, it's possible. And you need to know these concepts because you need to know the difference between what all typefaces are to be used in a particular context and what are not to be used. So I'd like to discuss why is it important as well. It usually grabs the audience's attention or the viewer's attention. And over here, as I mentioned as the first point, it exists literally everywhere. So you need to make sure that it looks good or you use the right kind of typography that attracts the right kind of audience or the audience that you are targeting for. And it makes the text reader friendly. As I said before, you need to know what kind of audience you're targeting and you need to make sure that the audience easy for them to read that content. So you need to know what kind of fonts to be used, and if you use or if you choose the right kind of font, it's gonna hold the audience's attention really quick. And if you have a brand, it's gonna build a recognition. If you're gonna create your own typeface or any sort, it's gonna build a recognition, as you have seen in um, what these kind of logos. Now, suppose if I use the Netflix typography for Amazon Prime, you'd obviously know the difference between them because you have seen it. You have seen what kind of the logo is being used for the Prime one and the Netflix one. So it's going to create some sort of copyright stuff for that as well. So you need to know what kind of fonts to be used and what kind of fonts are licensed and all that. And if you use a particular kind of font, it gives a value and a tone to your brand. As I said, it builds a recognition, so it's going to build a value, of course. And it conveys a message in an aesthetic way. So if I sort of keep a white text in a white background, it's not going to send any sort of message to anyone. So you need to make sure, I mean, people wouldn't be that, you know, careless to have that sort of. I just explained what kind of example it could be. So this is why it's important, why typography is important in a way. And for now, I guess that's all for the importance part. And till now, I mentioned what kind of terminologies that are used and what kind of typefaces that are used, the difference between the typefaces and the fonts, and the importance of why you need this. And for all of this, you need to know, as I mentioned, you need to know what kind of audience are being targeted, right? So there's a certain psychology that's being associated with this. So I'll move on to that. Also, these are certain types of typography that are being used. See, it depends on what kind of audience you're targeting, so or what kind of context you're having. So I would call some of them. There are some genius typographies which you could look into, and these are some of the examples of that. And so basically, it gives character and an emotive role in graphic design. So also, I would also mention that it makes life easier, and your readership is going to make it easier by what you've written, and it's possible to quickly scan the text on what you've written or based on your context. Anyway, the next one is the font psychology that I said I would be mentioning right now. So over here, we have like different sorts of personalities in humans, right? So we have mood swings, we have emotions, and we need to. So all this, the font actually impacts the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of the audience or the humans in particular. So when it comes to branding, and emotions can be expressed by a number of ways over here. You can choose the right kind of color, the kind of logo, the tone, or whatever your context is like. So, fonts usually have an important role to play in sparking the right mood uh, on what kind of event you're conducting. So, you need to know, like, if I use a normal font for a technical sort of event, which does not really match with it at all, is going to look really, really boring and unattractive, and people wouldn't bother to look at it. So you need to know that uh, what kind of colors attract the audience, what kind of thoughts are to be expressed through that design you're going to share, or what kind of feelings are going to be impacted, and all that. So in font psychology, it actually helps you to choose the right fonts for your designs. So when you learn this particular concept, you will get to know what kind of font you need to use. So as I've mentioned below, there are like emotional responses to certain kinds of fonts. So for a serif font, it's going to be trust, respect, authority, formality, and there are more. I've only mentioned a few of them. Uh, as in, that's a sort of classification in serif font, and in sans serif font is more like modern, straightforward, sophisticated, and all that. In script font, I've mentioned it before, it's more like elegant and fancy, creative, happy, traditional, and all that. So based on this, you would know what kind of fonts are to be used. Anyway, I read some researches where two researchers they say that high quality typography appears to induce a positive mood. And I've pictorial represented some of the fonts that represent some emotional responses. So in the first one, that frosty ice cream, it indicates happy. And when we usually see it, we feel happy when we see that. And it's mostly about ice cream. So obviously we would feel happy about it. And in the second one, it's more like sad. You have to also compare the context on what it's being used for. So in the second one, it's obviously sad, and it's the fonts are being used accordingly. And for the third one, it's more like authoritative, like the ones which we use in news channels or newspapers. It's completely like really challenging. I don't know, more like authoritative as it's mentioned. And there are like certain surveys conducted to find out if different fonts can induce certain emotions or not. So this is all about the basics for typography, and or all you need to know, or it's not mostly everything you need to know. These are like the basic ideas behind typography, and you need to usually know more about it if you're going to dive into it. And lastly, I would say that typography is everywhere and it's important. And if you're mainly looking into this, you need to know the certain concepts related to it, which which will make you a better designer, or it will make you create better designs. So that's all it for this topic, and thank you. I hope you guys understood the concept, and if you have any questions, you could pass it on.
Thank you, Rama. I guess we'll move on to the Q&A session now. We have a few questions here. One of them is name some of your go-to typeface choices. Hello, Rama. Can you hear me?
Some of my go-to typeface choices are like, it depends on what kind of context I'm going to be using. So for this one, I use like a normal typeface. It's supposed to be simple. That's why I chose this type of typeface. It's Calibri, and it's going to look really simple. For example, if I'm going to use like some sort of a technical poster. I usually design posters. So in those, it depends on if it's a technical type of ones. I usually use the modern type of fonts or the futuristic kind of fonts. You could know like if you have seen the movie Tron, the stuff, the fonts like that could be used. Not that I would use that, but I would say like that. And there are more to it. It depends. As I said, it depends on what kind of context I'm using. So I don't really have like a particular type of go to type faces, and yeah, that's all it.
Okay. The next one here is that what are the basic typographies in the IEEE guidelines?
The basic IEEE typography that I used is Roboto, Formatter, which are being used for logos. Uh, Calibri is also used. These are like the basic ones. So you need to know like there are certain fonts, but these are the basic ones that are used in it.
Okay. Another one is what is baseline in
Anything else?
typography? What is and we have another question here. It says what is baseline in typography?
Baseline in typography is mostly, I guess I explained that axis part where that's where the letters mostly sit, and above which there are ascenders, the part which extends above that baseline, and the part which that line is the axis line or the baseline. That's called the baseline where the descenders extend or the ascenders extend. That's baseline in typography.
Okay, we have one more question. How does typography affect design?
I suppose I didn't mention that, but that's one of the terminologies that's being used in the concepts.
Okay, so I guess we'll wrap it up.
How does typography affect design is, as I said, it depends on that font psychology. So it's gonna evoke like it's going to impact the different feelings associated to a person. So if I'm going, if as I've showed before, like if I'm going to use the sad font in a happy one, it's going to look really boring and it's going to look very unrelated to the context that you're being using. So the typography on what your context is, depends entirely on what your context is. And what kind of pictures are you going to use, or what kind of illustrations you're going to use. Accordingly, you're supposed to be choosing the typography as well. So it depends that way. It conveys a message mainly. So you need to know what kind of typography are to be used.
Okay, we have a few more questions. I hope that's okay.
I guess I answered that question enough.
Where should we give importance to typography?
Uh, as in like in a particular font, or as in, all right, if it's in a particular font, you, as mentioned, the type of context that you're going to be using, it depends on what kind of typography you're going to use, right? So, in that particular thing, we need to mainly look into the overall tone of that, or you have to adjust what kind of content that is being required, and if you're using it in use a user interface or a web design, you need to know the tone of that website, or in order to increase the experience, you'll need to create what kind of typography that's being required for it. As far as I know, that's it. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll have the last question now. It's have you used handwritten fonts?
Custom handwritten fonts, I haven't tried much of that. I've obviously looked into the mockups, but I haven't tried creating one on my own or anything like that. I'm working on that, but it's not as good as before. So, yeah, I'm still working on that.
Okay, Rema, thank you. With that, we have come to the end of the Q&A session. And with this, we
All right, are there
conclude.
any more questions?
No, that's all for
If
today.
that's the end of it, then I guess thank you.
Thank you,
All
Rema.
right, is there more questions?
No, we have come to the end of the Q&A session. And with this, we conclude today's session of Color Your Space. Thank you, Remajothi, for this wonderful session on an introduction to
All
typography.
right, so
It
I
was
guess I'm done with the.
Yeah, it was a very informative session, to be honest. And yeah, so stay tuned for more enlightening content that will inspire you to chase your passion. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day.